She couldn't let him go. She wanted to feel him close. She wanted to feel his strong chest. She knew that this would be her last opportunity to let him know how she felt. "Wait," she called. "Wait for me." He turned and stopped, silhouetted against the hot southern sun. Lifting the hem of her long skirt, Eleonora ran towards him. Throwing herself into his arms, she pressed herself tightly against his sweating body. She could barely wrap her arms around him. He was so manly. Pressing her head against his heaving chest, Eleonora felt his sweat cover her cheek. Please don't go," she begged. "I love you." Tom's voice rose from deep within his chest. "I love you too, my dear. I was afraid you wouldn't want me after what I had to do." Lifting her face to look at him, Eleonora stood on her tiptoes and offered him her sweet lips. "I will always love you," she whispered into his mouth before he pulled her against his body. Eleonora's breasts heaved with passion as they shared a deep kiss. Wanting to show him that she was not afraid of his strength, she pressed herself close to him. Carol carefully inserted the bookmark and closed the book. Turning over, she placed it on the bedside table and glanced at the clock. "Midnight?" she thought. "I wish I could go to bed earlier. I have to be at school at 8. After she turned off the desk lamp, Carol rolled over again and snuggled into her husband's side. "I wonder if he wants to wake up," she asked herself. She knew she wanted sex. Reading novels always had that effect on her. Lifting her nightgown, she exposed her thighs and crossed her leg over Jim's. She squeezed his leg between her thighs. What's wrong?" Jim muttered. "Can't sleep. I have to get up early." Freeing himself from her embrace, Jim turned away from her and began to snore quietly. "Damn," Carol whispered under her breath. She lifted her hips and lowered her nightgown back onto her hips. Her last thought before she fell asleep was the image of her fantasy Tom standing with open arms in front of her. "I hate these early morning meetings," she said to no one in particular. The sun was already hot and she was sweating, pressed against the leather seat of the car. The twins sat silently behind her, their ears filled with headphones from the CD player. "Hey, there's a parking space up ahead!" she almost shouted, even though she knew the twins couldn't hear her. Pleased with her luck, Carol waited patiently as the woman driving the van maneuvered to make room. Pulling into the parking lot, she turned off the ignition and waited for the twins to close the door before pressing the lock button. "Go to your classes," she told them. "I'll meet you when you get home. Don't miss the bus. Today is my bowling day, and I won't be able to pick you up." "Bye, Mom," they said in unison, and walked towards a group of their friends waiting for the bell to ring for class. Carol noticed several cigarettes being held in the clenched hands of some of the boys. She tried, but couldn't remember if she smoked when she was a freshman. Stephen's teacher was a young woman in her late 20s. She was wearing a sleeveless blouse and gray trousers. She greeted Carol and asked her to sit down while she looked for Stephen's file. This wasn't as complicated a meeting as they come, Carol thought as she walked back to her car. Stephen needed to do his homework and stop fooling around in class. While she was there, she asked about Stephen's sister, Sherry. "I wish Stephen was more like her," the teacher said. "She is polite and wants to learn, while Stephen jokes too much and disrupts the rest of the class." She could have told me that over the phone, Carol thought. I didn't have to come here for her to tell me that. It's not like he brought a gun to school or anything. Damn, it's hot. Why the hell did we have to move to Alabama? There are other places they could have moved us to. The store was not crowded at this time of morning, and Carol grabbed a few things. Placing her cup of hot coffee, purchased from the deli section, on the roof of the car, Carol placed her bags in the back seat and got behind the wheel. A shadow loomed over her, and she looked up to see a slightly familiar face peering inside through the tinted glass. The window hissed as it rolled down, giving Carol a better look at it. This was their new neighbor. "Hi, do you remember me?" he said. "We moved into the house behind you 2 weeks ago. I'm Paul Dwyer." "Oh, yes," Carol replied. "I remember you. How are you?" Raising his hand, the neighbor lowered her cup of coffee and handed it to her. "I'm fine, but I don't think it would have made it to your house," he said with a laugh. "I thought you might want to drink it rather than wash your car with it." Carol responded with an embarrassed laugh. "Thank you. I forgot I left it there," she said, and took it from his hands. "See ya," he said, and stood up to leave. Carol found herself staring at his shorts. Sitting on the bed, Carol took off her socks and sneakers, crossing her arms and lifting her shirt over her head on her way to the bathroom. Throwing her socks and shirt into the dirty laundry basket, she picked them up under her arms and decided to take a shower. Her remaining clothes followed her socks and shirt into the pile of dirty clothes that had accumulated at the top of the hamper. "Time to do the laundry again," she sighed. The bowling league started at 1 o'clock, but Carol liked to arrive a little earlier so she had time to warm up. This was the only time she could practice. She and Jim used to play in a mixed league, but they pulled out when she was pregnant with twins. Taking her book from the bedside table, Carol went into the bathroom and sat on the toilet. Opening the book to the page she had marked the night before, Carol continued reading. Eleonora woke up suddenly. Her back and legs ached from the strenuous activities of the afternoon. The sun had already set, and she didn't know what time it was. Tom lay next to her, his long hair covering part of his face. She leaned in to kiss him. The moment her lips touched his cheek, he flinched, causing Eleonora to step back in fear. "What's wrong? Are you okay?" she asked. "I dreamed about you," he said, and pulled her towards him. Eleonora wanted to get up and wash herself, but she allowed him to hold her against his body. "I need to get up and wash myself," she said, and pushed his chest away. "You're not going anywhere," Tom replied and pulled her across his body. He held her close to him for a minute. "Please don't," she begged. Eleonora screamed, but she knew it was useless. Tom was a rough lover. She wasn't prepared for his rudeness when she rushed towards him just a few hours ago. Submitting to his power, Eleonora tried to relax as much as possible to protect her body. Suddenly, it was all over. Again, she didn't make it in time, but that was okay. He will learn. She will teach him. Carol felt a tingling sensation between her legs as she marked her page and placed the book on the stand in front of the toilet. The hot water felt good as Carol washed her hair. She stood under the stream and let it flow down her body. The noise of the bowling alley was a blessed relief from her fantasies. Carol focused on her bowling style and bowled well in the practice match. The cold beer tasted good, and she sat back, relaxing. The other bowlers began to gather in the center, and she greeted them as they passed her table. As captain of her team, Carol needed to fill out a league sheet and list any replacements who could play with them that day. There were no replacements, and she was finishing up filling out the paper when she saw a pair of tanned shorts in the corner of her vision. She recognized them as belonging to Paul Dwyer, and her eyes seemed to try to penetrate the material, lingering for a moment on the zipper of his shorts. His voice brought her out of her thoughts, and she looked up at his face, smiling down at her. "How's your coffee?" he asked with a smile. "It was good, thank you," she replied and smiled back. "Do you mind if I sit down?" he asked. "No, of course. Sit down," she replied. He was an attractive man, a little balding, but he seemed to be in good shape. Carol felt her nipples harden under her bra cups. "I hope he doesn't see them," she thought, and looked down at her chest to make sure. The loose material of her shirt hid them from his view. "Do you play in this league too?" she asked. "I'm a replacement on the Pacemakers team," he replied. "I hope the title doesn't mean they're all old people." "None of us are old, but many of us are older," she corrected him with another smile. "Stop smiling so much," she scolded herself. "He's just another guy. He's not hitting on you. You're just imagining things." "You are working?" she asked, and immediately regretted the way she had phrased the question. "Yes, but I work from home," he replied, without showing that the question bothered him. "I can manage my own time. Within reason, of course." "Oh, what are you doing?" She became interested. "I'm a consulting engineer for chemical manufacturers. I do most of my work over the phone or computer, and with FedEx, I don't even have to go to the post office. It's a good job if you can get it," she said lightly. "My wife is also an engineer, but she has a regular job. She also travels sometimes, so I am often alone." Why did he tell me that? I didn't ask if he had a wife, Carol thought. Am I sending him some kind of signal? Maybe he saw me looking at his crotch. I wonder how old he is. She tried to figure out if his comment meant something or if he was just sharing information about himself. I better go and find my team, he said and looked around. I have a list here, she said, and handed it to him across the table. Paul's hand rested gently on hers as he read the list of commands from the paper. Carol's reflex was to pull her hand away, but she suppressed the impulse and did not move. His fingers lightly stroked her wrist as he continued to read the list of commands. This is it, he exclaimed. Tracks 3 and 4. See you later, right? His last words were accompanied by his grip on her hand tightening and a slight squeeze before he let her go and pushed his chair away from the table. See you later, he repeated and smiled again. Carol felt sweat form on her upper lip and she knew she was blushing. She looked at him, but no words came out of her mouth. When he turned and walked away, she realized that her mouth was open. Closing it with a pop, she turned around in the plastic chair. It's funny. He makes me feel like a schoolgirl. That night, Carol almost attacked Jim when they went to bed. She was naked and waiting for him under the covers when he came out of the shower. He always slept naked, so there was no barrier between them as she crossed his leg and pressed her breasts against his chest. What is this for? He asked when she finally pulled away after a long kiss. Have you done something? He laughed. Of course not, Carol replied, brushing her lips against his. We have no secrets from each other, right? I'm just like this tonight. Just. Can't a wife want her husband? Any time before I fall asleep? He laughed and pulled her towards him. Oh, wow, Jim exclaimed as Carol relaxed against his chest. He caressed her back from her shoulders to her buttocks and back up. Sorry, honey, he said and rolled them both onto their sides. But you're too heavy. Carol froze for a moment, but didn't let her know how much his comment hurt her. So much for romance, she thought. I love you, Jim said and kissed her before turning his back and pulling the blanket up to his shoulders. Carol realized that she was not as thin as she was on their wedding day, but she was 43 years old, she had survived 2 pregnancies, and gave birth to 3 children. What did he expect from her? Carol stood up and went to the bathroom. Jim was already asleep and did not move when she left the bed. Carol turned off the bathroom light and opened the door. The bedroom window let in enough light for her to navigate the room. Looking out the window, she saw light coming into the Dwyer's home across their backyards. It looked like it was in their bedroom. I wonder what he's doing there. Is his wife at home? Is he making love to her? Jim had already left when Carol was fully awake. The children were old enough to get up and go to school on their own, and they didn't bother her in the morning. She lay in bed and stretched, planning her day. Tim, their eldest, still hasn't decided what he'll do after graduation in 2 months. He was accepted into several colleges, but made no effort to choose one. He started talking about joining the Marines, and Carol found some brochures while cleaning his room. Speaking of cleaning, she said out loud and rolled out of bed. She decided to skip the shower until she finished her morning cleaning and washed her clothes. Wearing her old lady robe, as the children called it, Carol went downstairs barefoot and prepared a pot of coffee. She washed her face and brushed her teeth while the coffee dripped before starting to clean up after the kids. The twins' rooms were easy enough to clean, so she tackled them first. They did a good job of tidying up their clothes. She cleaned the rooms and vacuumed them for about 10 minutes. Holding a plate of toasted bagel on top of her coffee cup with one hand and a Cosmopolitan magazine in the other, Carol opened the patio door with her elbow. It was a beautiful morning, and the sun was warming the picnic table just outside the patio door. After setting down her breakfast, Carol swung her legs over the bench and sat down to enjoy a few quiet moments before starting her chores. Since no one was around, she sat with one leg raised on the bench next to her and the other leg extended under the table. She didn't bother pulling down her nightgown or buttoning the front of her robe. Mindlessly leafing through a magazine, Carol drank coffee and chewed a bagel. An article in Cosmo called Touch Techniques caught her attention and she started reading. The article talked about where to touch your man and how to excite him with your fingers, lips, and tongue. By the time she was a third of the way through the article, she was mindlessly rubbing the inside of her thigh and sliding her fingers down. I need to try some of these techniques on Jim, she thought. Maybe I can keep him awake a little longer. Tilting her head back as she drank the last drops of coffee from her cup, Carol looked over her cup and met the gaze of Paul Dwyer, who was leaning on the fence separating their backyards. She stopped with the cup pressed to her lips. Paul smiled at her and waved. How long has he been standing there? She thought in panic. Shuddering and removing her hand, Carol lowered both feet to the flagstone patio and locked her knees. She tried to pull down her nightgown, but realized that she was still holding the cup. She couldn't get her body to do what she wanted. She tried desperately to appear casual while her mind was consumed by the possibility of what he was seeing. Hi, she said weakly and waved back. It's a beautiful day, isn't it? It gets even more beautiful from where I stand, he said. That little muscle in her groin twitched, and Carol felt her nipples harden against the nylon of her nightgown. I need to go back inside, she said, and stood up. I have things to do. See you later. Yeah, see you, he replied and stood there while she packed her breakfast and hurried into the house. Oh God, this is so awkward, she said out loud. I wonder if he saw me. He probably liked it. Carol was used to talking out loud to herself and used this technique as a kind of reality check when she was worried about something. Carol almost threw her plates into the dishwasher and rushed upstairs. Her mind told her that if she kept busy, she would stop thinking about things she shouldn't think about. Opening the door to Tim's room, she was not surprised to see the usual mess in which he lived. Quickly gathering his CDs and books and placing them on his desk, the sheets were clean, so she made his bed and vacuumed the floor. She moved at twice her normal pace to distract her mind from her body and its reactions to Paul Dwyer. After returning the vacuum cleaner to the hallway closet, she dragged the dirty laundry into the laundry room, placing Tim's trash basket on top. After she started the washing machine with the whites she had sorted, Carol emptied the trash from Tim's basket into the trash can. A shiny piece of foil caught her attention as crumpled papers tumbled out of the basket and into the bin. When she took it out, she found a lubricated condom wrapper. What is he doing with this in his room? She asked herself. He couldn't bring a girl here? He never stays in the house alone long enough? Carol knew Tim was sexually active. She once found a pair of panties under his mattress and knew that he kept condoms in his dresser under his underwear. She and Jim discussed it and decided that since he was already 18 years old, there was nothing they could do about it and were grateful that he was using protection. A quick shower, during which she carefully avoided touching herself more than necessary, left her feeling better. Lost in her bill-paying routine, Carol sat at her computer and balanced her personal and household expense ledger in record time. She composed a letter to the mothers of the cheerleading team, inviting them to a special party that was being planned. Carol loaded the paper into the printer and started it up. She was folding up paid bills and throwing away envelopes when the printer suddenly stopped printing. Damn. What now? She wondered, looking at the 2 copies that had managed to print before the printer stopped. The printer refused to cooperate, and she was unable to get it to work again. I'll have to go to the pharmacy and make copies. I need to send this today, she thought. Better call Jim and tell him the printer's broken again. She decided that her shorts and sweatshirt would be fine for a short trip to the drugstore, and grabbing her purse and keys, she walked through the kitchen to the garage and got into her car. The photocopier at the pharmacy was also broken. The announcement said it was expected to be repaired by the end of the day. Crap, she said out loud. Problems? She recognized the voice behind her as belonging to Paul. Is he following me? She thought. She felt her face turn red as she turned and faced him. No, not really, she said. I need to make copies and my printer is broken and the damn copier is broken too. Maybe I can help, he smiled at her. I have a copy machine in my office. You can use it anytime you need. Why don't you come in now?" A vision of her and Paul alone in his house flashed through her mind. She shook her head as if to drive him away, and he thought that she was rejecting his proposal. "You don't have to, he said with a smile. "I won't bite you." "Well, unless you ask," he finished, smiling again. "No, yes, thank you. I know you won't bite me. I'll take you up on your offer, but I'll have to come back later. I have a manicure appointment. How about in a couple of hours? Will that be okay?" "Of course," he replied. "Give me the original and I'll have the copies ready by the time you come. Here's my business card. You can call me when you're ready. In fact, you can come anytime." He smiled again, emphasizing the word come. "My wife is on a business trip. I can't believe it, but this guy is really hitting on me. I haven't been harassed in a long time." She felt herself stand up straight and arch her back to make her breasts more prominent. A plan began to form in Carol's mind. It was actually a fantasy. Her mind played tricks on her, and she found it difficult to separate fact from fiction. As she looked at Paul, she saw a ghostly vision of Tom flickering before her. Her blush spread throughout her body, and a bead of sweat rolled down her chest between her breasts. Her breathing quickened and her breasts began to heave in her bra. Handing the envelope with the letter inside to Paul, Carol watched as his hand grabbed her forearm and pulled her towards him. "I better go," she said. "Call me when you want to come," he suggested in a low voice. "Anytime." "It's come again. What if someone sees us? Maybe I'm imagining it." "Stop it, Carol." She chided herself and turned to leave the store. Her mind was spinning as she returned home and pulled into the garage. She sat in the car after the garage door had closed behind her, struggling with herself over her decision. "You can't do this," she convinced herself. "This isn't going to work. You're not even that attracted to him. Jim is a good person. Get your act together before you ruin your life. You're going to make a fool of yourself." Deciding to take one more shower before getting her nails done, Carol carefully shaved her legs and armpits in the steam bath. After drying off, she trimmed her pubic hair using Jim's electric razor. After cutting the sides, only a thin strip of hair remained. After completing her departure, she was worried about what she would say to Jim. She's never cut her hair this short before, and he'll be surprised. She will tell him that she did it for him. "Another secret," she said. "Once you store one, it's easy to add others." Moving as if in a trance, Carol applied lotion to her body and chose the sexiest bra and panties. After critically examining herself in the mirror, Carol held her slightly protruding belly with her hands. This made her breasts stand out even more. Lifting her breasts with her hands, she lifted them and decided that even if it was hot outside, she would need to wear tights. Her belly required a sculpting top. She carefully smoothed the nylon tights over her legs and watched herself in the mirror. As she pulled them up past her hips, she did that little dance that women do to stretch the last few inches of pantyhose over their body. The realization that she was doing this to look good for Paul Dwyer suddenly hit her. A brief feeling of guilt washed over her, but she continued with her vague plans and finished dressing. The light blue cotton sundress lay smoothly over her nylon-clad thighs and buttocks. "I look pretty good for an old lady," she praised herself and put on her high-heeled sandals. Her skirt swirled and rose as she did a quick pirouette in front of the mirror. Lifting her breasts with her hands, she placed them into the cups of her bra so that they sat higher. Her smile was content as she admired herself in the mirror. It was cool in the hair salon, and Carol was mindlessly leafing through a magazine while waiting her turn. "How about a pedicure today?" The manicurist pointed to a sign hanging on the mirror. "Half off our regular price if we do it with a manicure." Carol hesitated for a moment before giving in to the tempting offer. There was no one in the store at that moment, so she stood up and reached under her skirt to take off her tights. Her feet dipped into a bath of warm water, and the monotonous voice of the manicurist, sharing the latest gossip, lulled Carol to sleep. She leaned her head back on the headrest and dozed off. "You have beautiful legs," Tom said. "I could play with them all day." Eleanor allowed Tom to lift her legs onto his lap. It was cool to sit in the shade of a tree while their horse grazed nearby. "You don't want to play with my feet," she laughed. "You want them to play with you, don't you?" Tom laughed with her. "Yes, my dear, you've got me again." "Mrs. Fielder, Mrs. Fielder," a voice broke through the haze of her sleep. "Wake up! You're splashing water all over the floor." The voice was not Tom's, it was the manicurist, and she was holding both of Carol's ankles in an attempt to keep them still. Carol's eyes opened and she assessed the situation. "Oh, sorry!" she exclaimed with regret. "I fell asleep. I'm really sorry." The manicurist turned Carol's chair to the side and spread a towel over the wet spots on the floor. Lifting Carol's foot out of the water bath, she moved her small stool closer to the chair and placed Carol's foot on the towel placed on her lap. "Who is Tom?" asked the manicurist. "Tom? I don't know any Tom. Why do you ask?" Carol lied. "You said his name in your sleep, that's all," she replied. "I don't know why," Carol said. "I don't remember what I dreamed about." "Well, well, who do we see here?" a male voice loudly declared in a quiet beauty salon. "Oh my God, he's watching me," Carol thought as she looked up from her journal to Paul's eyes. "What are you doing here?" she asked. "I came to get my hair cut," he replied. "Actually, this is my first time here, but if you're a regular, I will be too." Carol blushed when she realized that Paul's eyes were glued to the crotch between her thighs, as the beautician covered him with an apron and began to comb his hair. "Don't cut too much. There's not much left," Paul joked. "But you know what they say about bald men, don't you?" "No, what are they saying?" The cosmetologist continued the game. "It is said that some men use their testosterone to grow hair, and bald men use it the way God intended." "And how is that?" continued the cosmetologist. "We use it to grow some other organs." He laughed and slapped his knee with his hand. Everyone laughed, and Paul calmed down as the beautician tilted his chair back and began washing his hair. Paul's haircut finished around the same time the manicurist finished Carol's nails. Paul chatted about the weather and asked about good places to eat since he was new to the area. He kept his eyes on Carol, and she tried to be careful as she stood up from the chair, but she ended up standing on the footrest with her skirt raised high on her hips. Paul smiled at her attempt to pull her skirt down between her thighs and laughed as she pulled her tights out of the cabinet next to the sink. "Please don't wear them now," the manicurist begged. "You'll ruin your pedicure. Wait a few hours for the polish to harden, okay?" Carol hid the tights in her bag and thanked the girl, leaving her a tip. Paul was already at the register when she got there, and he gallantly made room for her to move forward. Placing his hand on her back, he pushed her forward with a gentle motion. "When will you come?" he asked when they left the salon. I need to get home first," Carol replied. She thought she needed to change her clothes or at least put on her panties before going to his house. "Don't stop at your house. Come right now," he suggested. "I'll wait. I'll leave the garage open and you can drive right in. That way your car won't be sitting in the hot sun." "Yes, sure," Carol thought. "You don't miss a chance, do you? You don't want anyone to see my car parked in front of your house." Carol hesitated for a moment before deciding to go along with his offer. Her thoughts were already racing ahead and thinking about what she would and wouldn't do when she got there. "Okay, but I need to stop by the bank first. I'll be there in a few minutes," she agreed and pressed the button on the remote to open the doors of her car. "Great," he said, and went to his car. The air conditioning had not yet begun to cool the car when Carol pulled into his garage. The roll-up door closed behind her with a distinctive click as she sat in the car, wondering what she was doing here. The door to the house opened and Paul's figure appeared in the doorway of his house. "Are you going to sit there?" He laughed. "Come in, it's cool in here." Carol got out of the car and walked past Paul standing in the doorway. "Welcome," he said and waved his hand in a mocking bow. Pointing to the envelope, Paul said, "Here are the copies. I made a few extra in case you need them. Would you like something cold to drink? Beer, soda, iced tea, cocktail?" Carol toyed with the idea of drinking a little alcohol to calm her nerves, but she realized that then she would have to explain the smell on her breath to Jim. "No, just a cold soda will do," she said. "Have a seat. I'll be right back," he said. Carol watched him leave. He changed his clothes and was now wearing a t-shirt and shorts without shoes. His bare feet made a slapping sound on the tiles of the kitchen floor. Taking the envelope, Carol looked at the copies and realized that he had not copied both pages on one sheet of paper. She made an "oh" sound just as Paul returned with her drink in his hand. "Is there something wrong?" he asked, handing her a glass of soda. "Oh no, I mean, yes. I wanted them printed on both sides of the same piece of paper," she said. "It doesn't matter. It will be like that. No problem." "Oh, I'm sorry," he apologized. "I can type them up in a minute. Let's go up to the office." Without waiting to see if she would follow him, Paul turned and headed towards the stairs to the second floor. Carol hesitated for a moment, but then obediently followed him towards the stairs. Paul had only climbed 2 steps when he stopped and turned around. "I forgot my drink. Come on up. It's at the end of the hallway. I'll be there in a minute." Paul put his hand on her hip for balance as he pushed past her on the stairs. Keeping his hand on her body, he ran it around and over her stomach as he walked down the steps. The office was tiny. It was more of a large closet with a window. Looking around, Carol saw stacks of papers everywhere and what appeared to be textbooks stacked on shelves along the wall. She lifted the lid of the desktop copier and lined up the first copy sheet. No need to waste paper, she thought, and inserted the copies he had made into the input tray, pressing the start button. She felt rather than saw Paul as he entered the room behind her. "Is everything working fine?" he asked. "Yes, it'll only take a minute," she replied and took a sip of her drink. Carol watched as the first copy slid out of the copier. She immediately realized that she had inserted the sheets upside down, and the new page was copied over the existing text on the sheet. "Oh," she said. "How to stop this?" "That's it," Paul said, reaching under hers and pressing the button to stop the car. "Let me fix this," he said, and pulled the upturned sheets of paper out of the feed tray with his other hand. Carol realized that the palm of his right hand was now pressed tightly against her stomach. He gently pulled it back towards his chest before letting go and shuffling the pages with both hands. He reinserted the copies into the input tray and entered the number of copies. "Be careful not to splatter your pretty dress with toner," he said, and stroked the front of her dress with both hands, pressing it tightly against her stomach. His fingers were just inches away from meeting her groin. Carol didn't know how to get out of this situation without causing a scandal. And besides, it gave her pleasure. She stayed where she was and didn't push him away. Working from the back, Paul restarted the machine, and they watched as the light came on for the first copy. "And what do you actually do?" she asked to diffuse the situation. "I'm a consultant," he replied, and walked away from her. Sitting in his chair, he moved the computer mouse and the screen came to life. The image of a beautiful red-haired woman filled the screen. She was completely naked, and the freckles on her almost white body seemed prominent on Carol. "This is my wife, Susan," he said by way of introduction. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Carol felt a wave of heat. Her face lit up, and she heard herself gasping for air. Holding onto the back of his chair for support, Carol leaned her hip against his desk. "Yes, she's beautiful," Carol barely managed to whisper from her lips. "You are a lovely lady, too," he said, without looking up at her. "Your charm is intoxicating." At first, Carol didn't understand what he meant. Then she realized he was talking about the smell of her sex coming from under her feet. Now she felt it, too. I have to go," she said, and placed her drink on top of his table. "So soon?" he asked without looking at her. "Stay a little longer." He emphasized his words by grabbing the inside of her right calf. "You're not in such a hurry, are you? I want to show you something." "Show what?" she thought. She didn't answer or make any attempt to stop his hand. The warmth of his hand burned her skin, and she wasn't sure she could continue standing next to him without fainting. Paul's left hand continued to caress the inside of her right leg just below the knee. He operated a computer mouse, and charts and graphs scrolled across the screen. He talked about chemicals and toxins, and Carol understood nothing except that her body was betraying her marriage vows. Carol wanted to move away but couldn't bring herself to. Paul made her feel wanted and attractive. At this moment, she was not a housewife and a mother. She was a sensual woman whose needs were met by a near stranger. Carol sat in the driver's seat of her car and thought about what had just happened to her. It was like a dream, or like one of her romantic novels. She avoided looking at him, and he didn't move from his chair as she turned and walked out of the office, walking down the stairs on unsteady legs. It wasn't until she made the second turn down the block toward her house that she realized she had forgotten the letters, which were still in the photocopier. Carol felt a little joy mixed with guilt when she realized that they would have another opportunity to meet when she came for the letters. She lay down on the bed. Turning over onto her side, she picked up her book from the bedside table. After stuffing pillows under her shoulders, Carol opened the book and continued reading. "Mom, we're home!" Carol's twin's voice interrupted. She closed the book and lay there for a while. "I wonder if I can really let him have sex with me," she thought. "Is it worth it? What if Jim finds out? What if I fall in love with him? It won't be stupid. You just want someone else to sleep with you. There is no love here, only sex." "Mother." "I'm hungry," said a voice outside her bedroom door. "I'll be right down," she said, and bent down to pull on her tracksuit. As she straightened up, her gaze fell on the Dwyer house, which was only 100 feet away. She thought she saw a figure in the bedroom window looking at her. The bright sunlight may have deceived her, but she felt exhilarated as she planned her next move. After preparing a snack for the twins, Carol peeled the potatoes and started dinner. She took some cordon bleu frozen meals out of the freezer and was picking out some vegetables when Jim walked through the door. She was on the phone with Tim, who told her that he would have to be late at practice when Jim got home. "Hello, darling," he said, quickly kissing her and hugging her. "I'm going to take a shower before dinner. Fine?" "Of course. I'll hold off on my elaborate micro-arm waving until you come down," she said. "On second thought, maybe I'll come up and wash your back," she added. Jim looked at her in surprise. She had not made him such an offer for a long time. "That would be nice," he said with a hint of caution in his voice. Carol checked on the twins, who were watching TV in the living room. She told them she would be back in a few minutes and went up to their bedroom. When she arrived, Jim was already in the shower, so she undressed and opened the bathroom door. The steam in the bathroom fogged up the mirror and shower doors. Carol walked over to the shower door and knocked on it, pressing her naked body against it. She saw Jim turn around and stare at her. Carol giggled and opened the door, stepping into the shower and finding herself in Jim's arms. He was all slippery and soapy, and she pressed her body against him. She was still recovering from the small episode that had happened just a few hours ago and was ready for more. "Easy, darling. Easy," he groaned. "You've got me so excited I'm on edge." They ate dinner, discussing the usual family stuff about school and how they could arrange a schedule to take the twins to softball and soccer games. Carol was cleaning the kitchen and the twins were in their rooms, ostensibly doing homework. Jim was watching TV and reading the newspaper when the doorbell rang. Who could it be? Carol asked herself. "Open it, please," she called to Jim. "I'm not dressed." A few minutes later, Jim returned to the kitchen, holding a manila envelope. Carol was momentarily scared when she recognized it as the one that contained the original cheerleader letters she had previously given to Paul Dwyer. "Our new neighbor brought this for you," Jim said. "He said he saw you at the pharmacy struggling with the broken copy machine and offered to make copies." "Oh, he shouldn't have brought them tonight." "I'll have to call him and thank him tomorrow," Carol suggested. "You don't have to call him. He's still here," Jim replied. "Do you want a beer or something?" he asked, turning over his shoulder. Paul's voice came from the living room. "The beer will be great. Thanks." "I'll be right there," Jim said, nodding for Carol to greet their guest. "But I'm not dressed," she said. "Oh, you look great. He's just a neighbor," Paul laughed. If only you knew my secret, Carol thought, and entered the living room. Paul stood up to greet her as she entered the room. "Hello, Mrs. Fielder," he said louder than necessary. "I was in the area and decided to drop by with copies." Paul continued walking towards Carol and extended his hand in greeting. Carol continued her comedy and, glancing over her shoulder into the kitchen, extended her hand. Paul grabbed her and pulled her towards him. Carol's knees buckled, and for a moment she thought she was going to fall. He said, "You're welcome. I still wanted to meet your husband." Carol gave him an angry look, and he smiled at her. Carol sobbed and pulled back, but he held her hand tightly. "Looks like rain," he said loudly, trying to get his fingers under her robe. "A little damp." "Stop it!" she hissed at him. "Stop it right now!" Paul let go of Carol's hand and stepped back as Jim's voice came from the doorway. "I'm going to the garage for more beer. There's only a couple of beers left in the fridge," he announced. As soon as the garage door slammed shut, Paul pulled Carol towards him again. This time his hands were on her waist, and he pressed their stomachs together. "Stop it! Stop it!" Carol whispered quietly but persistently. "Are you crazy? He could come back any minute." "It's okay. I'm watching," Paul said. "Damn, you smell so good and feel so good." Carol felt herself give in to the moment and allowed her body to relax in Paul's embrace. Raising her face to his, their eyes met, and Carol looked down at his lips. Paul took the hint and tilted his face. Their lips touched for the first time, and Carol's breath came out of her nose at the contact. It was a gentle kiss, their tongues brushing briefly before Paul suddenly broke the kiss and stepped back. Carol didn't hear the garage door open and didn't realize Jim was back in the house until she heard his voice. "I'll be right there as soon as I put this in the fridge. Make yourself at home, Paul," Jim called from the kitchen. "Okay, thanks," Paul laughed and reached for Carol's chest. She froze as Paul's hands cupped her breasts through her robe, and he leaned in for another kiss. Carol couldn't stand the tension and pushed his hands away, turning to sit on the couch as Jim walked into the room balancing a beer and a box of pretzels. "Have a seat," Jim said and pointed to the chair opposite the sofa. "Where are your manners?" Carol laughed, pointing to the box of pretzels. "I'll get the pretzel bowl." "Oh, don't worry," Paul said. Paul sat in the chair opposite them, and Carol and Jim sat on the sofa. Jim began asking Paul questions as Carol leaned back and crossed her legs. She knew Paul was looking at her feet, pretending to be interested in what Jim was saying. Jim became increasingly drunk as the evening progressed. Carol put the kids to bed early, and when Tim got home, he poked his head in the door and told them he was tired and was going straight to bed. Jim monopolized the conversation, and both Carol and Paul were bored. Carol winked at Paul several times, but at one point, when she returned from going for more snacks, she discovered that Jim had moved Paul onto the couch with him. This ended the game. It was getting late, and Carol tried several times to interrupt him and hint that it was time for Paul to leave, but Jim stopped her with a wave of his hand. Finally, Carol couldn't stand it anymore and said she was going to bed. Paul stood up with her and said goodbye. As Jim tried to get up from the couch, he lost his balance and fell over the coffee table. Trying not to laugh, Carol helped him up and pointed him in the direction of the stairs. "I'll be there in a minute," she said as Jim staggered up the stairs. Paul stood in the doorway and said, "See you tomorrow. Call me. I'll be home all day. I want to make love to you." After she locked the door, Carol turned off the light and walked up the stairs to her bedroom. Sitting on the toilet, she realized that her life was becoming more and more like her novels. "Dare I continue this?" she thought. "Maybe one more time. Once you keep one secret, it's easy to put them one after another. Soon my whole life will be a secret." Jim was already awake, but not in the best mood, when Carol returned to the bedroom after her shower. "My head feels like there's a drum inside me," he said, sitting on the edge of the bed. "You'll be late for work," she replied without sympathy. Carol was making coffee and toasting a bagel for breakfast when Jim walked into the kitchen. She poured him a cup of coffee. "Goodbye," he said, and tried to kiss her. "You smell," she said in a harsh tone. "Sorry," he apologized. "What are your plans for today?" "I'm planning to have sex," Carol wanted to say out loud. Instead, she told him, "I need to relieve Audrey at the crisis center today. It's only 2 hours, but someone needs to be there to answer the phone." "Have a nice day." he said over his shoulder, and the door slammed behind him. Carol had been thinking about what she was going to do since she woke up earlier. She had made a decision and was going to carry it out. She loved Jim, but she tried something different and wanted more. "Just this once," she said out loud in the empty house. The women at the crisis center complimented Carol on how good she looked. She was overdressed for a morning spent answering the phone, but it was just a quick stop on the way to something else. Carol called Paul from the crisis center and asked if he could make more copies for her. Paul laughed and told her that she could use everything he had whenever she wanted. "Then I'll be there around noon," she said, as if it were purely a business call. The next few hours were painful for Carol. She swung around in her chair and tried to chat with the other women working at the center. She was hot under her pantyhose and she could feel her panties getting wet. Afraid that one of the women would smell her, Carol went into the women's room and dried herself off. After spritzing some perfume on her panties and thighs, she returned to the call center. There were no calls from clients while she was on duty, so she told the manager she had work to do and left early. Carol's hand shook as she got into her van and inserted the key into the ignition. She called Paul's house while she sat there, waiting for the car and her body to cool down. Paul answered the phone on the first ring. He was excited that she would arrive early and told her that he would be waiting for her and would open the garage door for her. As promised, the garage door opened as Carol's van turned onto his street. She carefully drove into the garage and turned off the engine. Paul came out of the kitchen entrance as the garage door was closing. He was wearing a short robe and barefoot. "Oh my God, is he naked underneath?" Carol thought. Paul opened the van door and pulled Carol out to him. She turned in her seat and he hugged her and kissed her. Still sitting, Carol wrapped her arms around his shoulders and her body trembled with the intensity of the kiss. Both understood why they were here and were physically ready for the meeting. "Let's go upstairs to the bedroom," he suggested. Turning to him, she wrapped her arms around him and raised her face to his. "I shouldn't do this," she said. "I'm married. I don't know what came over me." "You're doing this because you want to," Paul reassured her. He kissed her softly on the lips, and she kissed him back. Relaxing her mouth, she enjoyed the softness of the kiss, which aroused the sensations in her stomach. Taking her hand, Paul led her upstairs to the bedroom. It didn't feel like a master bedroom, but more like a guest bedroom, with a small sitting room next to it. It was neat and clean, and the king-size bed with satin bedspread took up most of the space. Paul led her to the lovesit, which was facing the window. Carol could see straight into her backyard and her bedroom window. "I sit here and watch you while you work in the yard," he said. "Sometimes I can see you in your bedroom. I haven't worked much since I moved here. I've been obsessed with you. You're beautiful." Carol was now breathing faster as he turned her around and hugged her. No one except her mother had ever called her beautiful before. They kissed again. Carol groaned and let her head fall back onto the bed. "Oh my God, another secret," she moaned. Subscribe to our channel so that your second chaff doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think about listening to the next one.